Thank you very much for coming, and I'll try to take you to a history of man, actually, and thought, and try to correlate that to neurological methodology of brain itself. So it's a quite interesting journey, actually, and it's quite surprising. And these are findings that has been discovered only last maybe less than a decade, generally. So it completely changes perspective, both from a psychological point of view, and scholars that didn't have access to these type of imagery that ironically in our business ourselves we deal with them on a daily basis, and people that are in medical field are quite is quite normal for them in general. So let's start with basically how do we photograph when someone has an image of God. So we have gotten to a point basically that we can detect how brains behaves when we see something, or we see God, or we see spirituality as a whole. So this is really an introduction to biology of belief. Trying to reconnect what we feel to what actually machinery that exists in our brain that allows us to register it, generally. And I just want to emphasize also that you know that yourself, your brain, and your entity is basically, it's an analog machine. That means that anything that you receive has to be interpreted, whether it's physical reality or a spiritual reality or mysticism. So we don't have any methodology to directly sense, like an instrument senses a particular wavelength of a basically light and says this is red. We can't do that. We're basically an analog machine. So anything and everything that we sense and it comes toward us is basically interpreted by this machinery called brain. And this is what we're trying to explore and see how really we came up with these ideas generally. So if you look at, let's try to examine meditation and voyage, and that some of these mystics go through this process of meditation, and basically what do they do? Their basically emphasis is quiet self. That means that all the thought that revolves around oneself, or worries that you have basically thinking of what you like or dislike. The process is to get rid of that basically chatter that is self. And then whatever is left, it's a simple reality, something that is left which is true you, that is unaffected by these chatter that is going around. And guess what? Try to take a minute and try not to think. Just try right now, not to think. You see, it's impossible. So your mechanism of brain is designed to continuously think. So the process of meditative voyage is to allow oneself to deafen basically this process of chatter that is going on into our brain, that is trying to continuously basically tell you where you are, generally. So the practitioner, what do they do? The purpose of it is obviously quietness, allowing you to get to your simpler part of yourself, and that's the goal, to bring that out. And this part basically is a part that never changes. See, this is the true self. It doesn't get affected. It's not angry. It's not happy. It's just who you are. This is generally what the meditative journey is trying to achieve, generally. And it's not an attitude, actually. So it's not a function that may get affected. It's actually an entity of some sort, generally. And it's constant and it's real, basically. Now, when you take the worries, fears, desires, basically all preoccupation, conscious mind, and strip all of it away, basically, you're left with this entity. And that's really what people call it soul. Now, going back to the brain itself, there are two major segments of the brain that allows us to really interpret things. One is attention association area. This is basically an area of the brain that allows us to be goal-oriented and develop intention and execute those intentions. So concentrate, develop it. This is called attention association area. Don't worry about remembering these names. I'll show you what I mean. I have some pictures.
Make some copies.
The other area is called orientation association area. This orientation association area is basically an area of the brain that allows you to physically find out who you are, where you are in relation to other areas. So continuously your senses, like your hearing, your eyes, is continuously sending information to the brain, and the brain has two segments. One segment tells you what your boundary is. The other area detects what other boundaries are. So continuously, the reason you don't, for example, you walk and you don't walk into the wall is because your brain detects your boundaries and continuously feeding information what your surrounding world is all about. So this area continuously, when you walk, you don't really think that you're walking. That area is actually controlling continuously, bombarding actually this area of the brain with information that is coming from actually your ears, your eyes, your sense of touch, your feeling of heat, for example. So it's sensory area, and you can't shut it off. It's always there. And it's always sending information to the brain. So that's the two major area that we want to discuss. So what happens is that there is a process called basically SPECT. These are new invention, last maybe less than few years. This is photon emission computed tomography. And we have some physicians here, and I'm sure they can tell you exactly what it does. But from a physicist's point of view, what it does is basically they inject you with some sort of radioactive, highly lower dosage of radioactive material, and this goes into the brain, and they can basically detect images of different layers of the brain. So it's a very fantastic device. So if you look at basically a normal brain, you see that continuously the top portion of this picture, which is attention association area, is always is busy, is doing something. The bottom area, which this area that it is that orientation association area is always busy too. So as you sit, talk, whatever you do, your brain is continuously working. Now, then they did something quite interesting. They took a person that was in meditation, and they found out that actually attention association area is hyperactive, and the orientation association area is cooling down. It means that no activity is occurring. So it's cooling down. Now, of course, these pictures are not exactly real. I took whatever I could to just show you a contrast in general. So what the observation of the study says that if incoming flow of the sensory devices is somehow blocked, right? What does it mean, actually? That means it's temporarily blinded. Ironically, the sensory devices didn't go away. They're sending information to that particular orientation association area. But orientation association area cannot process it. So what ends up happening? What does it happen? Actually, what happens when you do this? that means that the borderline between yourself, right? Because that's orientation association area, and other people or other basically elements are broken. Now you feel what is called a Unitarian, means united, being united with something else. So once you know, you don't know what your borders are, border of yourself, what would happen? You feel in unity with other people. So this area is very important. We're going to use this later on. Just keep this in back of your mind. So, but in reality, we saw with the SPECT that that particular vision of that person feeling basically in the trance state is, his feeling is completely real. He's actually feeling that. So what the skeptic might say. So we found actually what physically happens. This is, they think that this particular state of basically the higher state that was induced is basically there is a yearning to connect to that divine. And what ends up happening, this is a chemical misfiring. Somehow we're interfering with this process, and chemically this thing is induced. In reality, the spec shows actually that although this process is unusual, but is really is working unusual, but is not misfiring anything, because otherwise we would have seen it. So in reality, it shows that people that are doing meditation, whatever they feel is real to them. Right? So the spiritual experience that your brain feels is completely real. Now, let's go to the brain machinery and science of perception, basically. Now, early humans actually learned to store food for future, plant crops, dig wells, bonded together. They created tribes, clans, developed ways of communicating, hunt together, share resources, defend themselves. And eventually they formed cities, nations, governments, religions, culture, technologies, and science. But what is it that brought this about? Is basically what we call it creativity, right? Insight. It's called genius, inspiration. These are elements that really caused this particular device called brain produce civilization, basically. So let's go find out what these things are, generally. So let's start with nerve cells. We know that the brain is basically full of nerve cells, and these are strings of billions and billions of cells that create a human brain. But if you look closely, it's two principles that allows these nerve cells operate. And one is the chemical stimulation. The other one is electrical conduction. So between these two, they really send messages and pulses between the entire brain structure and, of course, other areas of the body in general. But if you look at the evolution itself, the simplest worm has maybe less than 100 cells, nerve cells in them. And as you go through the species, you get into basically millions of cells, and then you go to billions of these nerve cells, which create those segments of the brain that perform a specific function. So now we know what the unit of the brain is. And these are basically the picture of it that shows you how it operates. Now, if you look closely, and again, there are two methods that we know how a brain segment of the brain functions. One is studying the brain damaged people, basically, and we know what type of function they lose. And people that have tumor, that surgeons operate on, it allows us in psychology to really study, and they know that that segment that was damaged, these are the functions that are missing. That was one issue. The other one is basically that process of imaging and layering the brain, try to figure out when we're happy which portion of the brain is active, because now we can tell. So we can tell exactly what happens in the brain, whether we're cold or hot, whether we're basically running very, very profusely, what happens in the brain, which areas are active actually, generally. So if you look closely, there are pretty good menu of activities that are going on. You have control of voluntary muscles, you have planning, problem-solving areas, you have motor speech areas, you have auditory areas, and basically interpretation of sensory experiences, memory, visual, and auditory patterns. So as you see, the brain is a pretty sophisticated machinery, and these billions and billions of the cells are creating this segment of the brain that allows us to perform those functions that actually created civilization, right? So other areas are basically understanding speech. Performing speech is one. Understanding what you hear is that area. Using words, for example. General interpretive area. You interpret what you hear. And basically visual areas and visual images, visual recognition of objects, for example. So there is an area which is your disk space that all these images that you have is going to get stored there. So this is really a very, very sophisticated device that we have generally. And there are two segments of the brain, and usually the left part, the left lobe, controls the right side, the right lobe controls the left side, generally. So as we discussed, we're an analog machine. And anything and everything we do basically comes to these sensory devices we have, and it goes to the brain, and we detect or feel, basically. So when you say something is real, that means that you're feeling it's real. You can't really know it's real. This is very, very important from point of view of when next time you tell somebody, I know, you question yourself because you feel you know. There is no such a thing, because you're not an analog device to exactly measure that event. So what it is, how does this brain figure out what is around us? What is the world, basically? So there are four major areas of the brain that we need to discuss as a lump sum, because we deal with it not as individual component, but basically the mythical potential of the mind is in these four areas. It's called visual association area. This is where basically all the images or your experiences are kept. You have orientation association area, which we discussed, which is something that tells you who you are, your physical boundary, and the physical boundary around you, what it is. Then attention association area, this is basically what we discussed before, and verbal conceptual association area. This verbal is, again, ability to speak, ability to hear, and translate what you hear to what actually the guy said. Right? So these are the four major areas which has mystical potential, generally. Now, what is visual association area? This is basically, sometimes you have during basically meditation or prayer, you get a visual picture of something. And this is really an spontaneous vision. You haven't seen anything, but you're basically dreaming some picture. And this is really where it comes from. Without you seeing something, you actually imagine a picture. How does this happen? That means that this area is capable of actually seeing things, and it seems very real to it. It actually sees it. It doesn't need the eye to see. And a good example of it is when you're asleep, right? You don't materially see things, but you see event pictures and you talk to people, right? So this area is so powerful that can actually simulate an event. It visually can simulate an event that is occurring. And interestingly, they have done studies of electrically giving it shock and see what it does. And of course, you get some visual experiences by stimulating it from outside. And of course, this is where the memory bank is. So the stored visions, remembering, again, whether consciously or unconsciously, go back and really go into this memory bank and pull these images out. So sometimes you go and see, well, I may have been there, right? But the reality is that your memory assembles these pictures that had and seen before and creates a movie out of it for you. So it's a very, very powerful area in the brain. Orientation association area, this is what we discuss, basically where you define who you are, the sensory devices that tells you what your body is, the limitation of your body, and basically what the other world is. What is the other area? And again, there are two operation areas located in each hemisphere of the brain that perform this distinct option. That means that the segment that performs your well-being of who you are and what your distance is physically, feeling who you are, is in one side, and the other area, the other basically that detects the surroundings that you have, is in another area. And guess what happens when you jump out of the plane? For the first second, you feel exhilaration because guess what? It's only you. There's nobody else. Because the other side cannot detect anything. You know? Of course, your limbic system a few minutes later tells you, what the hell did you do, you idiot? So it's quite interesting from point of view of experiencing reality and how powerful this orientation area is and how vital it is for us to detect who we are and who physically other elements are. So left orientation is responsible for mental sensation and limit physical body. And then right area is the physical space that is created containing that body. Right? Now, attention association area is the area where we call it seat of the will. This is where really you formulate what you want to do. See, you get this information and then you formulate that you comprehend the situation and you make an action. This is really called attention association area. These are the major apps. It's a complex body movement of behaviors, basically creating or attaining goals. That means you create a plan and you execute it. And that's really the area that we call attention association area. So these are behaviors and actions basically are there. and it focuses the mind particularly on a certain object or certain idea, trying to solve it, basically. And of course, emotional responses are part of that particular process. And of course, religious experiences, which are highly emotional anyways. So now verbal conceptual association area, this is really a naming and cataloging the world around you. So this is a primary responsible for generating abstract concept, relating to the words that you hear, basically. This is comprehending the language. This is the area that really dissects it and creates meaning out of this words that is coming to the brain, generally. So infinity, what is infinity? It's an abstract idea. We can't touch it, we can't feel it, right? So this is the area that allows you to say, communicate with somebody else or what you're trying to say and make them understand what you want to say. So it's a very, very powerful area, generally. So this is naming of the object. Why do we name objects? Because we need to communicate. We need to share concept with each other. And this is very, very important from even human relationship that exists. We assume what we say the other person understands. It's a false assumption, because it goes through the same interpretive areas, and based on the feeling, tone of your voice, they completely can misunderstand what you said. So you have to be cognitive that the other side is an analog machine that is receiving. It's not digital. It can't quantify what you say. So it's very critical to comprehend what is going on. And we can assemble words grammatically and logically extract logical meaning out of it. And this is this portion of the brain that does this. So verbal conceptual association area is really crucial for the development of consciousness, generally. Of course, through language. So now, how does the brain make its own mind? How does this basically brain got this perceptual power? Because this bunch of gooey stuff, bunch of nerves and cells and so on and so forth. So apparently, at one point, we could perceive ourselves. That means that our brain can actually, from a distance, can examine who we are, what we do. So that's where the consciousness starts to come about. We feel ourselves that beside this flesh and physical body, there is a consciousness. There is a mind that actually controls it and knows exactly who it is, what it does. So this particular process, awareness has occurred from this basically conglomeration of billions and billions of neurons, basically cells in the brain. Now, emotion, sensation, cognitions, and basically these are characteristics of this mind. So when you put all those aspects together, you see a consciousness. It's combination of those elements that we... when you look at neurology, you find out that they can't really explain from a non-material mind how a non-material mind can rise from basically a biological function. Literally, you created, something is getting created that is basically is aware of its surroundings. So as you see, the brain itself, that physical device, is making the mind, generally. So let's look at the brain architecture and what is objective reality. As we know, nothing really enters consciousness as a whole. We receive information through the sensory devices that we discussed before, and there is no direct objective method of sensing reality. So everything is basically subjective. So whatever comes to you is subjective, generally. So this brain, which is an analog machine, is taking the sensory and creating that perception. So objective reality really is when you experience something and prove that is right. So there is no situation that you can say, for example, that I know this is correct because I felt it. Because you're a subjective machine. So whatever this particular device is doing, receiving this information and really processing it and trying to correlate what you're feeling to that reality that exists, generally. Now, how do we detect God? How did this happen, generally? If God occurs to someone, generally, and its presence, how does it basically would appear to the human? Obviously, it has to appear to the brain or to the mind. There is no other methodology or sensory devices that we have that can detect something that is not material, generally. And even if it did, it would go into an interpretation of basically sensory devices to make sure it's real or it's not real, generally. So God cannot exist as a concept or reality anywhere else but in our mind. That's exactly where you can detect it. So basically the purpose of this segment is to show that the same way that we eat an apple pie and we really detect that the apple pie is pretty sweet and is very good and is real and you're feeling the joy of it, the same methodology is used for the brain to detect the supernatural, basically, or detect God, if it exists, generally. So let's talk about automatic nervous systems. The automatic nervous system is basically an area where it conducts, without any preconceived notion, it basically drives your body. This is called automatic nervous system, and it's two branches called sympathetic and parasympathetic function of this automatic nervous systems. And what are these two? Basically, they're called arousal system and quiescent systems. This means that there is a system that allows you to really get ready to fight. This is called sympathetic, that prepares the body for action. And then the other one is basically counterbalance of that. So you have these two methodology in the body that really controls your blood pressure and make sure everything is working well so you don't fall off, basically. So this is really critical in terms of the systems that exist, and these are counterbalancing each other. And ironically, not both of them are active at the same time. So these are really counterbalances that exist in the brain to regulate what we do. Now, there are different states of this particular two nervous system that we discussed. One is called hyperquiescence. hyperarousal. We have hyperquiescence with arousal breakthrough, and hyperarousal with quiescent breakthrough. So what does this mean, actually? Now, hyperquiescence is the state of extraordinary relaxation, and usually when you're deep sleep, you fall into that area. That means that your sensory devices are pretty quiet. This is called hyperquiescence. It can be evoked to elaborate rituals. So if they go to extensive ritual environment, it can cause basically this state in your mind, that you feel very relaxed, generally. And sometimes in chanting and group prayer, you feel this particular hyperquiescence feeling. Hyperarousal is the flip side of basically hyperquiescence, and it is characterized by unblocked flow of arousal and excitation, generally. That means that all your automatic system, blood pressure, everything is pumping and is going up and is getting excited without any limitation. And it reaches a particular climax. This is called hyperarousal, generally. Now, what happens is this. In this type of environment, also, the extraneous feelings and thoughts would disappear, actually. You're so involved in this particular process that you don't see anything else. And we'll discuss this a little bit later, of the use of these basically functions in human behavior in general. And rapid ritual dancing of Sufis is a good example of this hyperarousal state. You see Sufis, for example, dancing for 4 hours, actually turning. And it causes this hyperarousal in them, generally. Now, what is hyperquiescence with arousal breakthrough? This is really a state where you are in this quiet area, and it gets so quiet, you become so detached that suddenly you get overrun by arousal state. There is nothing to prevent the arousal. You have reached the edge of the quietness, and now an overflow is occurring. So this is really an important aspect. Sometimes people that meditate look at a cross, and they can induce this particular condition. Generally, that now they feel suddenly they're quiet, and all the chatters of the brain is disappeared, and now suddenly they feel ecstasy. They feel something very good is happening, and this is really that state. Hyperarousal with quiescence breakthrough. The same way that you push your hyperarousal activities to a point where it can go no further, and then quiescence breaks through. And suddenly you feel exhilarated, you feel calm. You feel you have reached your destiny, basically. The same way, through rapid ritualistic dancing, you can create this particular hyperarousal that at the end, if you reach that stage, you hit the quiescence, basically breakthrough, and you feel that exhilaration of calmness, basically. Now, let's talk about limbic system. Limbic system, as you see here, we're going to discuss, so you get a reference as far as where it is. This is really emotional brain. It's the limbic system. And basically, it's transmitter to God. That's what it is. The limbic system takes the emotional impulses, thoughts, perceptions, and then it produces all those feelings that we are experiencing, like disgust, frustration, envy, surprise, delight. So these are areas of limbic system that basically does this. And interestingly, when they put electrical stimulation to limbic systems, it produced basically dream-like hallucination. So it's a very powerful area that some of the sensation of deja vu and illusions and reported basically during spiritual state, visions that people see comes from this particular area. So, but the primary purpose of limbic system is the primal emotions like fear, aggressiveness, and rage. These are really designed, very primitive, basically, emotions that allows humanity in a primitive way to defend itself, generally. Now, what are the emotional functions of the limbic system? You have a master controller, basically. This main function is control the arousal and quiescence system. You have a watchdog. This is order emotional functions like love, affection, so controls that one. You have a diplomat in there, which is collaborates with watchdog to focus mind, attention, and generate those emotions. Okay. So how mind understands the world? So we know the where the feeling occurs, how the system is controlled by the brain. Now, we need to look at cognitive operators. These are operators that allows us to comprehend what we see, what we do, generally. This is the analyzer of the world around us, generally. Now, this area, this particular cognitive operators is unique to each individual. So you may have different strengths or weaknesses in different area, and you may interpret things differently. But most of this later on we'll find out that is really is acquired. So if you think that you're born jealous or for example, you have very possessive mind, all of these activities are actually acquired, is learned. You learn it from people around you. That's how it becomes. There is no system. And I see, for example, in Baha'i literature, you see that the human is born pure. It actually is proven. You don't have any pre-notion of the world around you. And you're creating this notion through this system that God has given to us, generally. So there are 8 cognitive operators. That means seeing the forest in the trees. That means when you see a tree, barks and leaves, you know it's a tree. And you can contemplate that if there is a tree, I can see many of them, therefore it's a forest. The rest of it is like seeing the tree in the forest. That means you can go to a car and look at the car and see there is a tire in the car. Although you don't see it separately, but the minute you look at it, you detect there is a tire. Or you look at the basically forest from distance, you can tell there are trees in there without thinking. So these are really cognitive operator. Mind taxonomy, this is abstractive operator. Mathematical mind, this is quantitative operator. These are all functions of our brain. How and why, this is causal operator, which is cause and effect. You can detect if you, for example, throw something, it breaks. So you can correlate action and reaction generally. And of course, this versus that, which is the binary operator, and of course, the existential operator and the emotional value operator. It says, what happened? So you try to analyze the emotion of the other person, generally. Now, of course, through these devices that I was discussed regarding PET, SPET, and MRI, we can tell basically a picture as these emotions that are occurring, we can actually detect where they are and how they operate, which portion of the brain it is that is getting impacted. Basically watch certain parts. So this particular technology of imaging allows us to really, in an objective manner, to detect what is happening in the mind, basically, and detect things that the mind perceives. So if God exists, it can only manifest in our brain, which is those neural pathways and psychological, basically, structure of the brain. Now, the concept of myth-making, this is the compulsion to create stories. And this has been with humanity since beginning of the time. And as you know, our ancestor, Neanderthals, was the first humans that buried their dead in a ceremonious way. And they put tools and weapons, basically. And it's very similar to what we do today, which is giving flowers, carved stone on top of the grave, and plant trees near that grave. So it's very similar process, generally. So this myth-making, this gesture of preparing the dead with gear to help them beyond this world, shows that even primitive cousins of ours had this ability of, or comprehension of, metaphysical plane, generally. So two things, it shows two things. One is that Neanderthals had such a brain power to comprehend the finality of death, basically. They could comprehend it, actually. And the second was they found a way, actually, to defeat that. They found a way to conceptualize death and accept it, generally. So these Neanderthals, obviously, they lived and they saw death around them because they were hunting. They saw animals that didn't have the limitation they had, because animals don't fear death, and if they get caught into that situation, there is no mourning, there is no process, and immediately if an antelope is attacked by a cheetah, the minute they escape, few minutes later they're back to normal. But humans have to live with this fear of death all the time, because they comprehend death. Animals don't. So this is really very important from point of view of showing that myth-making has been with humanity since beginning. And of course, even they found shrines of Neanderthals that people, they put basically bear skulls in a pyramid form on top of it, and they had altars, and they had basically animal sacrifices for their dead. So this particular myth-making process has been with us for over 200,000 years. Now, what happens with our hominids? Basically, these are human-like species that came later on. And of course, the stories got translated and passed to us, generally. So mythology is apparently coeval with mankind. I'm not sure if you know Joseph Campbell. He's one of the scholars that examine mythology of the early humans up to today. And he's passed away. But if you go to the UCSF channel, you can actually hear his classes. It's quite interesting. So what does he say? He says, as far back, that is to say, as we have been able to follow the broken, scattered, earliest evidence of the emergence of our species, signs have been found which indicated that mythological aims and concerns were already shaping the arts of world of Homo sapiens. So this particular myth making has been with us forever, generally. Now, what is myth? Are apparently as old as basically old as human culture, and we shouldn't write off this mythical thinking as the basically archaic past emotions. The myths are actually alive and well today. If you look at, for example, in story of Jesus or saga of Buddha enlightenment, this is not say it doesn't say that it's unnecessarily untrue. So being a myth doesn't mean it's untrue, generally. So it's not synonymous, but unfortunately myth in our mind and our dictionaries are synonymous with fantasy or basically falsehood, implies falsehood generally. But instead, in a classical definition, the word mythos, which came from, it's actually a deep sense of unquestioned authority. So this is really what the myth is. And it's as real as it can get. That's what myth is. Now, we need to ask simple questions. Why human mind compelled, actually, in every culture? So this is really not one culture versus the other. Created this myth. Initially, obviously, we can say that obviously they had fears of existence, and that's why they created these myths, and to comfort themselves in a world that was very dangerous to their health. But in reality, death has never been a stranger in natural world, and we know that because they saw animals dying around them, and in a hunting environment, they were familiar with this particular event. So why do we think as humans about death, but the animals don't? So this is really an area which so the whole key is really this particular process of mythology is crucial existent concerns that humans have, and the creation of the world, for example, these are abstract concepts, how evil came to be, for example, and these are always, the myths are pair of apparently irreconcilable opposites. So there are always two, heroes and monsters, let's say gods and humans, life and death, heaven and hell. So these are really mythology. If you go back, you see humans created this mythology. A majority of these mythologies are very similar across different countries, different races, different religions, and so on and so forth. So these stories, gods and heroes, death, resurrections, this is really healing the rift between heaven and earth, which there are many of our ancestors, basically Egyptians, had these particular stories that they have basically propagated. So the myths can be reduced to two separate issues. pairs of incompatible opposite, and then resolution to it. What do they portray? Now, ritual generally, as far as humans are concerned, is not necessarily related to religion, generally. We do rituals like, for example, rituals of basically going to a ball game. You have different types of ritual that you do for birthdays, for example. So their ritual is intermingled with the human behavior generally. And ironically, the studies that they have done is there's a link between ritual and evolution itself. So as evolution has occurred, the rituals have become more and more complex generally. And of course, interestingly, you can see the same behavioral process in animals as well. So if you look closely, here we have, for example, the mating of animals is a ritual process. The same way that in humans we have basically handshake, hugs, giving gifts, and so on and so forth. So let's look at the orientation association area and this neurological perspective of this ritual type. In an orientation association area, which we can basically separate self from the rest, and if this stream is interrupted, we can actually create that unity that exists within the group that is in a ritual state. So this is really neurologically how it happens when you get involved in a ritual activities of maybe a prayer, for example. So here is softening of self. That means that slowly you lose yourself and ideas that you have, and then this particular unitary process being united with other emerges generally. So that's how the neurology of it works. Now, of course, the rituals create the emotions and emotional states as well. And this is really psychology of it is in ritual prayers, it can be trigger positive psychological state and pleasant sensation when you go there. Now, ritual and myth connections is that as you see humans, for example, in a case of Christian theology, you have Jesus provides a pathway to God, and Buddhist belief is oneness of all basically, and Islam is submission to will of Allah. So this is really connection that you have as far as the myths are concerned. And the Joseph Campbell, which is that famous guy, no human society has yet been found in which mythological motives have not been rehearsed in liturgies, interpreted by seers, poets, theologians, and philosophers, presented in art, magnified in song, and ecstatically experienced in life-powering vision. So you see this particular process, culture, how powerful it is and influences whatever we do. Now, why do we act or myth generally? And this is really an area of the brain which, when you think something, you basically apply it. That's really the important part of this particular function. So you have to be very careful not to have negative thought. And you say, okay, this won't affect me. Unconsciously, we actually act out our negative thought. So if you think, for example, watching horror movies or will not impact you yourself, it's completely wrong. So the system that currently we exist in, that we're dealing with pornography, we're dealing with death that is occurring, or basically homicides that are occurring, this has enormous impact. Or movies that we show to children, it has enormous impact in their psychology generally. So we act these myths. And acting this myth is creating that bond that is required in the religious environment. So this is really the acting of the myth is embedded into our brain generally. Now, ironically, at the time Freud was saying that they thought these religious images were a sickness. It's some sort of a misunderstanding or mental illness. And they thought these illusionary triggers that were occurring was basically neurotic, and the reason we feel this way is because when we were children, we didn't have these fears, and we're trying to portray ourselves as a child which basically was unified with the mother. That's why we're creating this mythology in our brain to really satisfy our brain. Of course, many other scholars like Freud, later on, they found out whatever they were saying is completely incorrect. So last few years, the whole psychology and psychotherapy has been upside down because of falsehood of whatever they were preaching generally. Now let's go to, now this drunken Sufi is very important. This is Abu Yazid, to tell you that this mystical area that they were feeling through dancing for hours, and this is one of the poems that came from this particular person that says, I gazed upon Allah with the eye of truth and said to him, who is this? He said, this is neither I nor other than I. There is no God but I. Then he changed me out of my identity into his selfhood. Then I communed with him with the tongue of his face, saying, how fares it with me with thee? He said, I am through thee, there is no God but thou. So he becomes one with God, basically. Of course, these are falsities, obviously, of Sufi theology in general. Now, when you look at the mysticism and mental health, the reason I brought that is that we put, for example, manifestation in the same category of basically mystics that provided images and doctrines that many of us follow in general. So, and when they found out they did a study and asked people that really experienced, whether they experienced any out of the body experience, 35% of people said yes. This is a very interesting phenomenon. 18% of them, they had one or two experiences. 12% reported several. 5% said they experienced such events often. So it's quite interesting. This shows that this mysticism is something normal. It's not something that only happens to few people, generally. Now, this Freudian theory, which discusses oceanic bliss, which really relates to that line between self and not self, because when we're a kid, he assumed that we can't tell who we are and who somebody else is. Therefore, we don't have any fears when we are very small. So what he was mentioning, that these mystics, or these basically people that were practicing this transcendental meditation were trying to get that stage to become like a kid, generally. So he thought this is a psychological disease, basically. And this was his, he thought they suffer from neurosis or psychosis, basically. But the opposite is true. The significant research has been shown that the mystical state is higher level psychological health than the general public. So people that believe in religion, they're actually much more psychologically healthy than people that don't. And the ones that responded in the survey that they experienced mystical state, the ones that actually they said they experienced it, they're much higher in a well-being layer from the general population. So it's quite interesting. Reverse is being true. Now, what they thought is that these mystics, or for example, manifestations, are suffering from some sort of epileptic seizure. That's why, and then they were trying to explain why, for example, Muhammad basically heard voices and saw visions and profusely sweating, and how did this happen? And basically and so they thought he suffered from complex partial seizure. That's why he was seeing those things, generally. Or same thing with St. Paul, when he was faced with blinding light, basically on the road to Damascus, he was hallucinating. And of course, he believed that he heard voice of Jesus at that time. So what's the neurobiology of mystical experience? Again, it's losing yourself being swept away, and this goes into we experience this all the time. We don't realize it, but we do. When you hear music and you become very calm and you don't really care about your surroundings anymore. So this is really the same mystic experience that ordinary people basically experience as well. And again, it can reach that unitary state. Unitary means that being united with other people. Now, of course, as you see this, there is a unitary continuum. That means as you differentiate yourself from your surrounding and you lose yourself slowly, you would gain more and more momentum in terms of unitary states and experiencing that mystical experience. Now, in the 18th century, there was a guy called Nietzsche, and he proclaimed, actually in newspaper, God is dead. It says Nietzsche, and he was one of the biggest, basically, scholar of his time. And of course, another century later, Nietzsche is dead, and it's God that said that, because he couldn't survive, but God did. So it was interesting. Nietzsche in 1885 actually proclaimed that God was dead, and he believed really with his colleagues, Marx, Freud, and other people, Bertrand Russell, for example, they thought God was the vestige of an unscientific past that basically, as sciences and people comprehension of reality would increase, this God would disappear. Ironically, they thought the science would bring the explanation of events that will be occurring, and basically this God thing would go away. Well, in reality, God didn't oblige. So what ended up happening is that in this new millennium, you see the most advanced technological and scientific breakthroughs has occurred last few decades, and still spirituality and religion is really thriving. And if they were alive today, they would think that ignorance has won, actually. And really, humans cannot differentiate or basically experience reality, and they always need this fictitious, powerful entity to give them the courage to face the world that is basically has no purpose, generally. So this was their... Now, we know for a fact that the religion and physical health relationship, when you look at, they have done studies that the mainstream health, people that follow the mainstream religion live longer, they have fewer stroke, less heart attack, better immune system, and lower blood pressure. So they can see very, very clearly that people that really follow these doctrines live longer. As interesting is a doctor from Duke University that says that people that do not believe in God, actually lack of religious involvement has an effect on mortality that is equivalent to 40 years of smoking 1 pack of cigarette per day. So it's really deadly. Now, interestingly, to tell you how even perception of majority of people is until 1994, for example, the American Psychiatric Association officially classified strong religious belief as a mental disorder. And they were teaching this in schools, by the way. So this is really quite interesting in terms of how things change generally. So, and as we know, not only religion has a positive impact in physical health, the studies after studies are shown that it has a major impact in mental health. People that are religious basically don't abuse drugs, very little alcoholism, they don't basically subscribe into those vices that impact general public that are not bound by any basically religious belief. So we saw that basically because religious people frown from promiscuous sexuality, drugs, and alcohol, they live better as well, not only physically, but mentally as well. Now, of course, religion and control, this is really what the perception is, that the religion and belief in God, belief in that higher power, it creates that control that is necessary for us to really overcome the obstacle that we face in the life that we conduct in general. So this is really lifting us out of fear of futility, so we don't worry to die anymore. And although death is around us, generally. Interestingly, as if you read Baha'i religion, it emphasizes this as well, that even early humans had practiced rudimentary religion as well. So archaeologists have found traces of this particular process also. It's quite interesting where you look at it, the methodology that neurology describes is that really the cognitive process actually discovers God. It doesn't create it. So it is very important to comprehend from point of view of we don't invent a powerful God. We detect a powerful God. So it's very similar to the scientific process where you're basically finding forces or experiments, or you're discovering things. You're not making them. The same way your brain has detected God, basically, discovered it, generally. So this is the mystical is an experience, generally. Now all the religions are pointing to the same, basically, process, that the fundamental truth, unity of God, basically. And interestingly, it shows that the process of physical and psychological has an impact in well-being of humans. So if the gene of the human in an evolutionary process has created this particular ability in humans, guess what? People that don't believe in it, they're going to be extinct. Because the brain has produced a powerful methodology to survive. So people that don't subscribe to this evolutionary process are less likely to survive. So this is the scientific methodology that shows how religion influences basically human behavior and life that we discussed. So this unitary experience is basically, it's the window to God. This is the area where we go into and we can detect a higher being basically beside ourselves in terms of material existence. Now in scientific conclusion, if you look at the scientific conclusion as far as the material world is concerned, obviously science says that if I cannot measure it, weigh it, basically electronically transmitted, it doesn't exist. But in reality, the process that we went through, we showed that the impact of spirituality on the well-beings of the humans. So the same way a scientific process has occurred, we follow the same exact process. So we found out basically that guy that was doing transcendence and was praying really was looking for something that is actually real. So this is the conflict of the science and religion, which here it shows methodology that we use was purely scientific. And we didn't discuss any religion or any methodology of any religion to get to this point. But we proved that actually religion is embedded in us. Detection of God is embedded in us. So we didn't invent it. And guess what? People that believe and follow that particular process, evolutionary model, they will survive much better than the other guys. So this is really the whole process that we have to go and second guess our assumption about material reality. So if you look conceptually in Baha'i religion, describes as reality as one continuum of physical and metaphysical reality, so it's the same. The methodology we have to really detect it is analog, that means it's subjective, the same way that we cannot detect physical reality objectively, because we don't have the sensory devices, the same way we cannot detect spiritual reality objectively. So subjectively, we can actually see that God exists. We can feel God exists, and that's real. Thank you very much.